So with that, we're going to move to our third panel on the diplomatic wars. And it is presided by Jan St-Pierre from MOSECON. It's a German consulting firm on security and terrorism in Africa, which works with many think tanks and civil society members throughout Africa in different countries, and is very knowledgeable on this subject. And I'll let Jan introduce the rest of the participants. We are just still expecting Niegale BAGAYOKO, because she's been given a course, giving a course since this morning, and she's running late because of that. But we are in touch with her, and hopefully she'll be joining us during the panel. And so far, we're going to start to be on time with the panel in its current composition. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you for the introduction. The thing that Anastasia maybe left out is that mon accent français est un petit peu différent. So those recognize it know that I'm not from Europe, but from across the pond. Anastasia mentioned this morning that we have both the challenge and the privilege of starting this panel or being the panel right after lunch. That's always an issue. To those of you who were able to enjoy a glass of wine at lunchtime, lucky you. We had to stay. We had to be a bit more moderate. But fortunately, indeed, we have a fantastic panel, and the topic is really interesting. We had some of the conversations that we had at lunchtime demonstrated that people are very interested. And the advantage is that the two panels this morning already set up the table in a way by mentioning the global impact of the war. There's a lot of focus on Europe itself, but actually, probably the longer-term consequences of the war are outside Europe and on the world economy, but perhaps more important on the changes in foreign policy, the leverage, the relationships that European countries, that North American countries entertain with the so-called global South. I personally have to admit, I'm not a big fan of that expression, but nonetheless, it's a way of saying that there are countries that where we recognize finally or are becoming aware of their true value as world political actors. And we'll have actually three of these key countries or regions discussing India, discussing China, discussing African countries, and closing, of course, with the country that's trying to muster support outside of Europe, Ukraine. This morning, I believe Mr. Duckman said, getting support in Kinshasa or the UN vote. Well, of course, it was a bit cynical. It was meant to provoke. But we all know that the global support for Ukraine is very important, and we'll be discussing that. So as Anastasia mentioned, Niegale BAGAYOKO is unfortunately not here for now. Hopefully she does arrive, but the one who's absent and is joining us via Zoom is Velina TCHAKAROVA. Hopefully we'll be able to hear her clearly. And by the way, Velina, we wish you hopefully get well soon, and hopefully that the symptoms aren't too much of a problem and the effects won't be long-lasting. I've spoken enough. I will introduce our first speaker, who will be discussing India's role and how India's role situation, if it's benefiting or not from the war. That'll be interesting. So about Dr. Swasti Rao. She is an associate fellow at the Europe and Eurasia Center at the Manohar PARIKKAR Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis in India. It's a premier think tank under the aegis of the Ministry of Defense. She's undertaken significant projects in the collaboration with the Ministry of External Affairs and Ministry of Defense. And she has an upcoming book, which is always nice to introduce at events like this, Conflicts in Europe Amidst Shifting Power Structures and Europe's Indo-Pacific Outreach. I don't think it could be more appropriate than it is for today. She's an alumnus of Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. She's also you speak fluent Japanese, right?
Not very fluent, but yes.
Okay. Of the Tsukuba University in Japan. She's also a recipient of the Japanese Education Ministry Fellowship in 2011 and the Okita Memorial Scholarship in 2010 from the ICCR. And before joining her current position, she was assistant professor at the Department of Strategic and Security Studies at the AMU in India. And she is, if you Google her, indeed, she's very present in media and with commentary. And she's also the Indian representative at the EU Security Dialogue at the European Parliament this year. So Swasti, 3 minutes, I know it's not a lot, but I'm sure you can manage to explain India's role with Ukraine. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for a very, very kind introduction, and thank you, Anastasia, for this opportunity. Yes, I mean, as I look at my panel in the Global South, I can totally see why the Global South is a work in progress, quite literally. So we are waiting for one of our panelists to join. Nonetheless, the thing is that, you know, the topic that I've been asked to present today is something which is very close to my heart and something that I've been, I wouldn't say absorbed with, but actually obsessed with, you know, and I think this is something that you all would agree that if you're following the war in Ukraine and its global implications, chances are that, you know, in your own rights, you would be obsessed with that analysis because it's just so absorbing. So that said, I have put together certain points. I'm sure you'll give me an opportunity to come back again. But that said, you know, looking at it from India's perspective and what I'm sharing here is, of course, they are my personal remarks. I would definitely tell you what is the Government of India position, but I'll also tell you what of this presentation happens to be my own assessment of what is happening in Ukraine and how India is responding to it. But for sure, and I like to begin it from here because it is a positive beginning, which is that the Ukraine war has been an enabler of conversations which didn't exist the way that we see them now. And most of these conversations stem from 3 points. One is what has been India's position on the war, and I know it has been a very controversial and I think less understood in this parts of the world, but now I see that that thing is evolving, and I think there is a better understanding. So India's position on the war, India's interpretation and practice of what we call our strategic autonomy, and India's response to the 3 crises, the 3 Fs: fuel, food, and fertilizer. And out of these 3, I think that the one with fuel, you know, India's purchase of Russian oil has been something that must have caught everybody's attention, and I'll be discussing that. And here, as I mentioned about the 3 Fs and India's response, I would like to mention 2 important points. One, that longer the war stretches, it appends India's strategic calculus in its continental domain. So, you know, I'm sure you're aware of the India's geography. So half of India is continental versus half of India, which is maritime. And in the continental domain, we have 2 unsettled borders. And we had a particular kind of strategic calculus to serve the, demands of this continental domain. So our strategic calculus in the continental domain, of course, with respect to China, because one of the borders that we have still unsettled is with China, and we have fought wars, over that, latest being in 2020. And of course, for the larger Asia, where India is wary of an Asian order which is led and dominated by China. The second is that the war is happening at a time when India has been at the pinnacle of its intersectional global moment, and I think he's signaling me.
You have time enough.
Okay, I have time enough, fine. So you can just signal me when my 3 minutes are over. So I think the war has been happening at a time when India has been at the pinnacle of its intersectional global moment. If you allow me, what I mean by it, it is that in 2023, India held the presidency of the SCO, which is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the G20. And I'm sure G20 was a resounding success. It was also the year when India's economy inched close to, $4 trillion US. India had a spectacularly successful moon mission, and India saw unprecedented growth in defense and technology ties with the West and an unusual upswing with the European players itself. But at the same time, India kept engaging with Russia and will continue to do so. So if I'm sure in later, rounds, I'm going to talk about it more. So this intersectional global moment is important. And one of the questions that it kind of throws on us is that, do we have this intersectional global moment because of our neutrality on the war, or despite the neutrality on the war? And it is an interesting question, and I would like if somebody asks me, on that. But for sure,
Apparently not me.
but for sure, what we can see is that, what we call as strategic autonomy or multi-alignment in today's times is completely different from what it was in the Cold War times, when it was rather passive, versus the current multi-alignment, which is really very active. And that is what leads us to this intersectional global movement. Now coming to the war in Ukraine, and I'll be quick, I think there is a better understanding of India's security concerns. I already told you about the continental domain and everything. The second thing is that India for sure is recalibrating its Russia strategy, because Russia is getting pushed with China, and that is a very, very major concern for us. But having said that, there will be a continuity and change, and I'll come back to that, because a lot of my research has to do with how Russia is getting pushed with China and what really does it imply for India. The more important thing that I can definitely tell you is that despite the fact that we have been buying a lot of oil from Russia, we have not been able to start the rupee-ruble mechanism, because this lot of oil trade has landed a huge trade deficit for India that India is not really able to do anything about. And the situation is that you have trillions of rupees stuck in Russian banks, Russian accounts in Indian banks, and you have nothing to do with that. But as just the concluding thought, and we'll come back to it, I think the point is that India would need a lot of stability, in the world order to continue with its success story, economic success story. And it's precisely for this reason that India is aligning so much with the West when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. But having said that, there are so many things that I would like to come back to, but maybe in the second round. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Concise, thorough, and really a bunch of questions that I will not ask, but please the public later on, without a doubt. Velina TCHAKAROVA, I'll turn to you now. You are the founder and director of FACE in Vienna, and you're also the former director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. You are also a member of the Strategic and Security Policy Advisory Board of the Science Commission of the Austrian Federal Ministry of Defense. You're well-traveled. You've worked on a lot of reports, including for Eastern Circles on China. Welcome, Niegale. BAGAYOKO. Thank you very much. I'm glad I don't have to take her spot. It's a really complicated topic, so I'm glad she's here. Velina, you prepare a lot of reports on China, on India as well, and therefore, it would be interesting to hear your take, because China is in a peculiar position since the war escalated. Its relationship with Russia changed. It's probably more, I guess we could argue that it's the dominant partner now in the relationship. It also now has a push and pull relationship with the West, in the sense where the West is trying to de-risk or decouple, for lack of a better term, but at the same time they want to court China, whether it's for climate change or to try to use China as a broker for the war in Ukraine. So there are a lot of changes, but at the same time, it's not only positive for China, it's also changing some of its own plans. The Belt and Road Initiative, of course, has undergone problems because of the war in Ukraine. And therefore, how is China adapting to this changing landscape? And on another level, is actually China the power broker with regards to the war in Ukraine that the West is making it out to be?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure being with you today, despite the fact that I couldn't be there in person. So let me use these 3 minutes to kick off my session with the following statements, and I will proceed then with answering the questions during our discussion round. First important point I want to make is that when we analyze and put Russian calculus in the context of the bilateral relationship with China and the multilateral relationship with the Global South, you need to understand that this calculus consists not only of the primary goal of subjugation of Ukraine, but also of 2 further equally important goals that are quite relevant. And the second being the destruction of the security order in Europe as we know it and as we've known it for the last 30 years. But more importantly, and this goes now for the relationship with China, is the 3rd most overlooked goal, and that is the goal of getting the pole position in the newly emerging systemic competition between United States and China. So in a sense, I've been arguing that the 24th of February 2022 has been also the manifestation of the beginning of the Cold War between the United States on the one hand and the dragon bear, that is the modus operandi between China and Russia, without the need of entering any military pact or strategic alliance in the Western understanding of this kind of treaties and alliances. And I will explain later what exactly I do mean by that. So pole position, that means that Russia is first-tier strategic player in the systemic competition. Why? Because from China's point of view, the worst case scenario is actually a three fronts competition with not only United States globally and India regionally, but then of course with Russia if an inverted Nixon-Kissinger approach would have been applied on Russia, similarly to what happened in the 70s with China, while United States and the Soviet Union were the primary systemic competitors. So you need to understand this calculus, because knowing this geostrategic calculus help us understand also the expected steps taken by these players. And this is exactly what happened, in a sense that it was very easy for me, first and foremost, to foresee and actually set the date of the beginning of the war after the 20th of February. And second, it was also very easy to foresee the set of measures and actually actions that China would take to provide a comprehensive support for Russia during this war. Meanwhile, I even argued that the supply line that has been established from North Korea to Russia to provide the ammunition is actually considered as an alternative lifeline that could also provide military aid to Russia from China without practically exposing China as a direct importer. So why is Russia so important from China's point of view in this totally new geopolitical and geoeconomic context, one may ask? And here I argue that first, China is a unique Asian player that, contrary to the Soviet Union and previously, of course, Great Britain and United States as maritime powers, is going to pursue a hybrid approach of becoming both terrestrial and maritime hegemon in the Asian continent and beyond. So Russia is important as an entry ticket for the control over the Arctic on the one hand, and second, for the control over the Eurasian landmass. China cannot do it on its own. But of course, why is also China considering Russia being important? And I really want to provide these contrarian points because the overwhelming position right now in Europe is that Russia is the junior partner of China. And by actually having this kind of let's say, definition of the relationship, a lot of the nuances, I argue, are missed in this relationship. That's why I want to expand a little bit the contrarian framework for you. So here, a second important dimension I see is, of course, the cooperation in the defense industrial space complex, which I think is probably the most overlooked one in this modus vivendi of strategic coordination between the two players. So once again, these are very different calculuses. So if we look at it from the Russian perspective or from the Chinese perspective, but we see a lot of overlapping right now, of course, when it comes to actually providing not only an alternative to the Western / American narratives and rules and sets of norms and so on, but also when it comes to actually creating a complete alternative socioeconomic network with all the relevant structures and forms involving, of course, what? The Global South. And yes, we've heard Global South is not necessarily a term that is perceived in a positive manner here in Europe. I've been talking about it with various European bureaucrats, but I can assure you, while traveling around the world, that the Global South is actually a term that is quite welcome when it comes to those countries coming from the Global South. And here I see 4 particular domains in this Cold War 2.0 that are going to be equally important. And here, once again, Russia sees itself as a game changer. That is why it bets on a long-term continuous support from China. Okay. The first most critical point, and I will complete, okay. I will finish with really one sentence only to outline the 4 domains without going into any details, is obviously the political economy, and just the keyword commodities tells you everything about the match in heaven between China and Russia. The second important domain is the technology, I mean the 4th industrial revolution. The third one being, of course, the diplomatic arena. This is the arena about setting the new rules of the game. And the 4th important domain is practically the way how actually these competitors forge new partnerships and alliances. And if you think about it into detail, you will find a specific niche for each of these domains when it comes to the Russian, to the relevance of Russia for China.
Thank you very much. A lot of material again as well, but I also enjoy the fact that it creates what you said, echoes, and I guess creates a good bridge to our next speaker, to Dr. Niegale BAGAYOKO. She is the chair of the African Security Sector Network, and as we know, since this morning, she is also a lecturer at Sciences Po. Thank you very much for joining us. TCHAKAROVA mentioned, the new global partnerships, the diplomatic arena, commodities, and in this sense, I think. Obviously, it's presented that way in the program, talking about Africa. We know Africa is not a country. It's 54 countries. But at the same time, with these new arenas, it's arguably the most intense battleground for foreign influence. And that appears to have intensified in the last year and a half or 2 years. We know what happens in West Africa with the French, in other areas. And the positions are very different, of course. The views, the history of each country, they all have their own priorities and determine the partnerships based on that. But I guess we could sum up the positions with what Macky Sall, the president of Senegal, said last year at the Dakar Security Forum about Africa having its own problems and mentioning, well, there's clearly a double standard when it comes to dealing with conflicts. And therefore, how has the war in Ukraine changed the leverage dynamic or dynamics, plural, for African countries with Europe and elsewhere? And can Ukraine, in your opinion, maybe compete with China, India, other countries, Turkey, the GCC states, in an area that is highly competitive in that arena? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be there. Sorry, I was lost, as always, in the École Militaire. As regards Africa, I think it is, in fact, very important not to consider it as a battlefield.
Okay.
It is important
battleground,
to considering increasingly as a player which is presently expressing its willingness to make its own real politics choice in terms of diplomacy, as well as in the realm of security. I think that what the war in Ukraine has made visible is a phenomenon which had been developing for years, I would say for at least a decade, if not 20 years, and which is in fact that most of African countries have diversified their partnerships. I think that European partners, and especially the French one, were absolutely sure to be almost the only one to be very committed to Africa and to be seen as privileged partners. But in my view, several dynamics have challenged this reality, which tended to be true, I would say, at the end of the 90th. The
turn of the
90th
century, yeah.
turns, exactly. What happened first is that it has to be recognized that European partners, friends in particular, but also multilateral partners, be they in the UN circles, the European Union, and also, very importantly, African multilateral organization, have been completely failing in addressing the kind of insecurity which is presently at stake. At least in some region, particularly in the Sahel. But if you look also at what is happening in Congo, for instance, or even in Sudan, where the United Nations are also invited to leave, as they have been forced to do so in Mali, you can realize that all the system to prevent, to manage, to solve conflict, which had been defined at the end of the Cold War, has been completely challenged. And it is in this context that the re-emergence of Russia, because it is a re-emergence. It's not, of course, you have the case of the Central African Republic, but it is a very particular case. If you look at the history of Russia and a number of African states, and in particular Mali, which is its major partner today, they have been forged just after the independence, in fact, because the first president of the country, Modibo Keïta, decided to put an end with the cooperation with France to the benefit of the former USSR and other socialist Soviet republic. So there has been developing during at least 30 years a key and very intimate relation between Russia and Malian elite, not only in the military, but also in civilian areas. And I've always been very impressed by the number of Malian decision makers perfectly fluent in Russian for years. That's not new. So this first element is very important. Second, until 3 weeks ago, I would have told you that Russia had been failing as Western partners in changing the security situation on the ground. But it happened something very important 3 weeks ago, which is that the Malian government has been able to reconquer the city and the region of Kidal, which in fact has always been the objective not only of the junta, but in fact of the southern military Bamako elites, including when they were under a democratic rule, let's say. Fighting terrorism, fighting jihadism has never been the real priority. And I think it is something Russia understood, and they have been providing support to do so. They are still failing as any other actor in fighting jihadi groups, which have been committing since then lots of attacks. In less than 8 days, there has been 7 or 8 attacks almost every day, but they have been very successful to do this. And finally, it is also important to say that I think they have been able also to win the informational warfare. I've never been very interesting in all those theories presenting Wagner Group as a predatory, mercenary group, completely a kind of international militia. No, it is clearly, in my view, a tool of the Russian state, which has been used in a very smart way, including, and I will stop there, including by trying to understand what is really the local context. Yep. They have been able to understand which kind of NGOs were important. They have been the first one to realize that NGOs were far from being only liberal ones, but more and more nationalist ones. This is a crucial point. And finally, as regards the question of the position towards the war in Ukraine, most of the African states have made clear that they want to develop relations with every power sharing interest with them. And today you can see that in Niger, with the junta, you have both the Russians and the Americans who will stay together, not working together necessarily, but they both stay there.
Perfect. That aligns well, I think, with what Swasti was saying earlier about multi-alignment.
Multi-alignment.
I think that's a wonderful expression that fits well also with what Velina was saying. Hennadiy, MAKSAK, you are the director of Prism Ukraine, Ukrainian think tank based in Brussels, but you've been very active with on the issues of foreign policy, advocacy for Ukraine. You've done a lot of fantastic reports. Anastasia mentioned your yearly report on Ukrainian foreign policy. 2023 was also a period of very high challenges in that set. We're talking about potential new allies for Ukraine, but with everything that's been going on politically speaking, whether it's in the US or in Europe, the EU being divided or being more and more divided on the issue of Ukraine, the paralysis, if we want to call it that way, in the US regarding the budget and the position in Ukraine as well, is creating even more challenges, and we'll add to that, I guess, in terms of media and information, the war in Gaza, in Israel, that is deflecting some of the attention, of course, in a different way. So how is Ukraine adapting to this, and how is it? Does it have a plan in terms of foreign policy for what is looking to be a very, very difficult 2024?
And thank you so much, and it was my pleasure to start cooperation this year on some publications with Anastasia help and assistance. I think it was a good endeavor on our side. Yeah. But I'm afraid I would be boring in my first comment, and I apologize because I know it's a challenge to stay alive and not asleep after lunch. But I have to unpack what we mean in these alliances when we fight Russia, Ukraine fights Russia, because I think there are multi-layered approach, and each of these layers is very important. For Ukraine, for our diplomacy, as we say, you mentioned this publication we do annually. We assess foreign policy along 50 directions, be it functional or geographical. But last year, 2022, we had a special edition, and we called it wartime diplomacy, which is totally different to what we have in peaceful times when it comes to our activities and our skills, be it diplomats, be it civic advocates. So I think now our diplomacy is like playing chess on multiple boards at the same time. And I'll try to enumerate these layers. The first and foremost, coalitions on the level of international organizations. what was mentioned during previous panels, that we try to forge coalitions in United Nations, General Assembly, trying to adopt binding or non-binding resolutions and trying to indicate and to showcase where Russia's aggression is and what are the results of this aggression. So I think it is important for us to continue this work, and in this coalition we look forward not only to European allies but to our partners from global partnership in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. So I think it's very important for us to keep on this track, which is very important to be vocal, to stay afloat on the level of international organizations. Next point is sanctions, which is also important to deprive Russia of resources to fight aggression war. The process is mixed, but believe it was very poor prior to big war. Now we have 11 packages. We're still trying to negotiate 12th package, but I think that the level is incomparable back to 2021 even, not to start from 2014 when war started. Next point, our diplomats trying to secure armed deliveries. Here we have also some positive developments. We have Rammstein format, which is 50 plus, which is a good coalition. And here we see that this coalition is not only about European Union and United States, it is way bigger. And I think it's also important for us to keep this track and to try to communicate to our partners our needs in terms of type of weaponry, number of ammunition we need, and the aim we have for this ammunition in Ukraine, because it's also very important to communicate. Next point, financial support. It was profoundly covered during previous panel. We need that. We are incapable to keep our economy on track without financial support from external partners. It just fluctuates, but the sum could be $3 or $5 billions per month just to keep us afloat in social sphere. Because all the money we have and generate in Ukraine, we all trying to put it to military aims to defend ourselves. Next point, justice dimension. Probably you've heard about special tribunal for the crime of aggression, about war crimes, about crimes of genocide. We're trying to be vocal and to talk to our partners. There are some coalitions and groups. One is trying to document the evidences of war of aggression. Some trying to find modalities of this new tribunal. Some documenting war crimes, and we will be having in the end prominent Ukrainian civic activist who is just trying to do it at her best. Next point is reconstruction. Also mentioned in previous panel, but it's very important to mention, we have some platforms already. It is still a big challenge to find resources, because even at this point we have to recover some kind of infrastructure which is important, which is critical for Ukraine, be it in services for Ukrainians or for our hospitals, for our schools. So it is important to have all the money in place for Ukraine. It's also mixed process with mixed results, so I think we have to also communicate this direction. Russian assets freeze, arrest and maybe transfer to recovery is also a big challenge for Ukraine. We have discussions on European level. I think there is gradual success, but still I think it will take some time just to get in depth to this process, to find legal instruments and mechanisms how to proceed with this transfer to reconstruction. Exchange of prisoners of war, which is important issue, and at the moment there are thousands and thousands of Ukrainians which stay on Russian territory, on occupied Ukrainian territory, and since I think early this year the process stopped. In some waves of exchanges we used our own possibilities of our secret services, of our intelligence, how to communicate with Russians, but in some cases we used our partners, Saudi Arabia, Turkey to help us with these processes, and here we also need some help and some assistance from our partners. What is very important, it also not very often on agenda of discussions, that Ukraine also proposes post-war dimension, post-war architecture of security. Maybe you've heard also about peace formula, which has 10 points, which are quite different. and it proposes how gradually we can move from war to regulation when the conditions of Ukraine are met. I mean territorial integrity and sovereignty of our state. Humanitarian global initiatives, when you talk about grain to different regions, to our partners from global partnerships, I think it's also very important. European Atlantic integration, I will stop on this because I have still
I can imagine.
Yeah, but I would say that why I'm trying to name all of them, because I think it is approach of Ukrainians a la carte.
Yeah.
For when you're talking to different partners, we can align them to different coalitions. For example, Grain for Ukraine coalition has 38 members who aligned with this policy. When it comes to Rammstein coalition, we have 50 plus.
Yeah.
When we have peace formula, the last meeting in Malta, it was 80 plus. So for different type of cooperation, we need different type of partnerships. So I think this is our approach that we have adopted with this second year of war. I will stop here because I know.
No, it's actually perfect because I think I guess the term is multi-alignment. You mentioned à la carte, so adapting to the needs and priorities of each. So my next question is actually to all four of you, but Swasti, I'd like you to answer first. Is what's the leverage in multi-alignment? I mean, how do the relationships, Swasti, the historical relationship of India with Russia, tensions with China, new relationship with African countries. Niegale mentioned, the changing dynamics within Africa. This way of realizing that the dynamics are changing. Velina was mentioning, the 4 points in different areas where that calculus is being part, and at the same time, what does that mean for Ukraine, for à la carte? Can Ukraine be on the one hand, excluding Russia, can it play on multiple fronts or be aligned, having multiple alignment? The same way, because you mentioned, I think a key word is Turkey, right? Turkey found a way over the last 3 years to become, the same with Qatar, to become a power broker in various regions. So, yeah, how does leverage the multi-alignment, what does that entail? What can it look like?
Well, now this is, I think it's a very deep question, to be honest, because, the roots of multi-alignment, at least for the Indian experience, comes from, like rather simple explanation of how the world was mired into 2 world wars, and there were a lot of countries in the world which didn't really have anything to do with it, but were forced into fighting those wars for somebody else's sake. And I think those experiences are very real in the Indian psyche. A lot of Indian soldiers lost their lives, to these wars that they had nothing to do with directly, just because they were part of certain empires. So I think when they got independence, one of the things that they embarked upon as a fundamental outlook of their foreign policy is to not get aligned with any bloc. Yeah. And I think that is where you get the rationale from. Now, the other question is that, is it true for the contemporary world where you don't really see that kind of bloc politics, but the world is much more related, interrelated, and, in that sense? I think what then happens is that you will see that there a lot of middle order powers would want to keep all their options open and are constantly playing all sides. To put it casually, and if you want to put it more formally, perhaps you can say that they're constantly hedging their bets because the world is so uncertain, and they do not want to lose out because somebody else took a decision to attack somebody else. Right. So I think that is where you understand why there is a growing number of countries in the world that would want to remain multi-aligned, because they do not really see themselves as triggering this particular war. Now, this is just one, but there are a lot of other things also into this debate. For example, you mentioned Global South, and I wanted to mention it the earlier time, but of course, since we had only 3 minutes each, I think what is really what one needs to understand is that India actually sees itself as and tries to convince the world too that it is the leader of the Global South. And here, India is in a direct competition with China that also sees itself as a leader of the Global South. And somewhere it kind of wins it technically because it comes with deep pockets and the BRIs and all of that India doesn't really have. Having said that, India tries to posit itself as a country which has great relations with East and the West and North and South. And because it was under India's G20 presidency that African Union was actually made the member of the G20. So India tries to put itself as an ideal candidate to actually speak up for the rights of the Global South, being a colonial, so to say, a colony, etc. And then to deliver on those promises of the Global South, India needs to remain multi-aligned because, again, by definition, by logic, how would you speak up for the concerns of the Global South, whether it's the climate or whether it's economy, whether it's about settling trade in your local currencies, etc., if you are aligning very clearly with one of the blocks. So I think those are the reasons when you see that one of the normative foreign policy outlooks that India today has is that it is championing the causes of the Global South, and that also pushes this narrative of remaining multi-aligned at a more global level. Having said that, I'll just kind of say something as a concluding remark, which is that India's multi-alignment should not be confused with equal distribution, because at the same time that we are multi-aligned, but we also realize where exactly the growth is going to come from. And I always say that India's intervention with the SCO is definitely not equal to India's intervention at the G20. The G20 is far more important to India. Similarly, India's membership of, for example, the BRICS should not be equated ever with India's membership of the Quad, for instance. So what I'm trying to say is that, of course, there is a priority, and multi-alignment by itself doesn't really mean that everything is just equal for us. I think it really doesn't mean that. What it does mean is that it would give you that space to to become a consequential hedger, as to constantly hedge your bets, because there is so much uncertainty in the global system. So I think that is something that I would like to say when you ask me what really would that mean. Yeah. But again, it also leads to problems, because for example, like I said, that when I talk to Europeans, a lot of Europeans would say that how do you expect Europe or the West to actually help India if India continues with this policy? So of course, there is no clear answer to this, because like I said, that this understanding of multi-alignment or the exercise of multi-alignment is not really rooted in the experience of the Ukraine war, but it is rooted in how the nationhood was actually imagined in India. So I think what that is kind of comes back to my takes it back to my original point, which is that I think we really need to have this conversation going as to what really is India's security concerns, and to that, in that sense, I think it is a good starting point, to have that conversation going. And about so many months into the war, about 21 months into the war, I definitely see that there is a better understanding within Europe of what really has been India's experience when it comes to nationhood. And similarly, even in India, back in India, in the initial, so to say, 1 month of the war, the understanding was very monolithic, which was that Ukraine war is happening because NATO is pushing eastwards. But I think when you talk to Indians now, even they are much more aware of all the internal complexities. I wouldn't say completely aware, but then definitely more aware of how things were back then. And of course, all this is being made possible by how Russia is being pushed with China. So for us, I think that is the most important thing that we are watching out for, because it is regardless of how good our relations with Russia are, or how good or how much President Putin appreciates or praises Prime Minister Modi. It's not to do with those kind of semantics. It has got to do with far deeper things. So I think this is what I have to say.
Okay, take note. It's great. Niegale, BAGAYOKO, with the multi-alignment, is that you mentioned the example of Niger. At the same time, Rwanda is becoming more assertive, you mentioned the multinational role, where it's taking a bigger leadership role. Is that also multi-alignment, and how is that?
It's been some times already that Rwanda, Paul Kagame, has been getting lots of influence and visibility. But what is very important, in my view, is not only considering international relations under, let's say, from an academic perspective, a realist approach based on hard security only, because of two things. First, it is very important to stress the fact that one of the main African narratives today is the competition between all what has been invested in the war in Ukraine compared to what has been invested in African conflict. In my view, it is not fair. It is not a fair narrative because, to me, the reality is that for decades, for instance, most of the United Nations peace operations, which are, let's say, costing 1 billion a year, have been held on the African continent. So, in my view, it is not correct to consider that Africa has not been paid enough attention by the international community compared to Ukraine. But it is the narrative which is the most widespread, not only within decision-making circle at the governmental level, but also within civil society, public opinion. So that's the first point. Second, so perception do matter as regards the international balance of power.
Yeah. Can you 1 minute? I'm sorry. Yeah,
yes.
just a minute.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And second, it's very important also to realize that I think you're mentioning Paul Kagame. Today there is also a soft power for strong men, for authoritarian regimes, and for a number of values they are promoting. If you look at all the gender-based approach, at all the questions related to LGBT, etc., on the African continent, you do have very conservative societies. And in fact, that's not that they are instrumentalized by Russia. It's been very disturbing to me to hear when there was this coup in Niger, but yes, it's Russia which is behind this. No, African are actors, they are not instruments. But it is a reality that there is a tendency to be attracted by authoritarian models and societal models, very conservative at the societal level.
That echoes some of the statements from this morning, so I'm glad that you dove into that and explained it better, especially in relation to the African dynamics. Velina TCHAKAROVA, you mentioned, you had a key word, calculus. So how does calculus, in terms of relationship, play into multi-alignment when it comes to China?
Well, China is in a very convenient position. I hear my voice now with the background,
okay, sorry. Yeah.
So China is in a very convenient position right now because when I talk about Cold War 2.0, it is an undeclared Cold War. It's contrary to what happened after the Second World War, where societies in the West were prepared because they had already seen the worst, and they were actually from more or less intellectually prepared to fight a cognitive, a psychological warfare, and all of the rest of the warfare dimensions. Now we are in a very different position because we have societies who have been used in the West to have 30 years of a break, and it's generational problem to prepare or to tell a society that it has to start preparing again for psychological warfare. We've heard about it from the first panel, the geo-economic warfare. We've heard about it in the second panel, and we will hear about also the military dimension. So this is a very, very convenient situation for China and also for Russia right now, because Russia is waging already an undeclared warfare, non-kinetic warfare on the European security order, on the European economic model, and on the European societal model. And it's a very convenient position because we are in a denial. It's very, very difficult, actually, for Western societies. I will leave the eastern part of Europe aside because Eastern European societies who come from the Soviet, post-Soviet bloc, they are familiar, they know what's going on. but they are in the minority when it comes to representation in the European Union institutions, or when it comes to trying to convey the message. You remember what happened before the war broke out with Baltics and Poland trying to explain. So right now what China is doing is actually playing a very convenient game of prolonging this period in which it can actually comfortably prepare for the systemic competition. That is why we are seeing a period in which there are conversations with Washington. They try to fool themselves that they are, mutually fool themselves that they are eager to improve the relationship, even though that both Washington and Beijing are not interested in stopping the decoupling process. And the same goes for Europe-China relationship, where aside from agreeing on having a conversation and smiling at each other, nothing substantial was really achieved at the European Union China summit, because in reality Europe is not able to convince China to stop supporting Russia, right? And so long as this condition is not fulfilled, everything else in the relationship, I would argue, is a function of it. So to cut it short, China will continue actually fulfilling its own strategies it has already set out. Nothing is in the hidden, nothing is surprising, everything is set out in all these strategies. We know how the Communist Party works, and it strives to become technological power #1 in the world, whether it's in this or in the next decade. Yes, we can argue about the geoeconomic power given the demographic changes, and yet we have probably 10 to 20 years of period in which China has all the tools, the military, the geoeconomic tools, the diplomatic tools, now with the help of multilateral networks, to actually compete with the United States and to use this undeclared, as I said, warfare situation in which it can increase its leverage. But as I highlighted, and I really want to highlight it once again, yes, weakened Russia is actually good for both United States and China. Dissolved Russia is bad for both United States and China. And we can argue here, we can use the discussion round for what it really means for us Europeans, because what it means, and we know for a fact the answer, is that we have to take the lead role when it comes to supporting Ukraine, when it comes to actually providing not only the enough for Ukraine to sustain every military phase, but actually to really regain its territorial integrity per 1991. It is up to us Europeans in the end, not up to the Americans or up to the Chinese. And here I think that there is still a cognitive dissonance, almost 20 months in this war, what our role, our European role is in this game. And let me finish with a very provocative statement, that is that out of all these multilateral vectors, the one that's being the most weakened, it could actually emerge as the most weakened one, could be in fact the European vector. So that means that United States and China pursuing their systemic geopolitical and geoeconomic interests would somehow deal with Russia in the future as well. But here, if Europe doesn't, get its game back, that means, of course, strengthened industrial base, strengthened alliances, and mostly, of course, providing the necessary help for Ukraine, because if Ukraine loses the war, it automatically means that Europe is on the losing side as well. That means that we may also turn into something that I describe as a geopolitical backyard of the global affairs in this decade. That means that with the power dynamics shifting eastwards and towards the Indo-Pacific, Europe increasingly may turn into this backyard of the global of the global events.
Okay.
And this is definitely what we want to prevent from happening.
Okay, excellent points. We have 3 minutes to argue, but I want to give at least a minute to Hennadiy to respond to this.
Okay.
Before we argue, then we can argue and throw stuff at each other for 2 minutes.
1 minute. First, I'm still uneasy with this term multi-alignment because it immediately gives me to another extreme, which is non-alignment. I think for Ukraine, it is not a dilemma. To win this war, we need to be with Western partners. I mean, Euro-Atlantic dimension and European dimension. That's why we have this cause as part of our constitution to be part of the NATO and EU. But to create new framework, architecture framework, we need global partnership. And for this, I think we need help and engagement with our partners in other regions. So I think to win, we need partners in Europe and on other side of pond, as you said. But yes, to make it happen for global peace and partnership, we need all the partners all together.
Excellent points. Excellent, I guess, semi-closing statement. So the floor is open for questions. Direct questions, please. Yes, sir. Then you, sir. Then.
Thank you very much. My name is Richard Ingham. I was very interested in all of your presentations, but especially the absence of any reference to the United States. Surely the future of the Ukraine war right now is not being determined in any sort of multi-alliance or multi-alignment kind of forum, but essentially amongst a handful of politicians in the United States. I mean, surely what happened on Monday with the budget fiasco, which blocked the aid for Ukraine. This is surely a wake-up call for you to think, let's focus our efforts on dealing with the people who are the big sponsors of support for the United States and for Ukraine. Let's look at what's happening in Washington. So, Mr. MAKSAK, do you have any comments on that?
Okay. We'll take the second question right away. So we'll, sir, yeah. Did anyone else have a question? Yes, you there in the back, Anastasia. Wow, yeah. Oh. And I'll ask Guillaume, can we get 5 minutes extra? There's a lot of questions this time.
Yeah, Kapitas from the Beast. I have a specific question for Swasti and no one else. Given that you work for Modi, and that here we have Chatham House rules and you're not going to be quoted directly, I'd like to know what has to happen before the world's largest democracy gets behind Ukraine full tilt boogie in this war. I mean, so far, you've given them a couple of school buses and, according to a manifest, a few crates of aspirin. Well done. What's it going to take for you to get in on this full tilt? And remember, Chatham House rules, I want to know.
Yeah, we'll let you answer those two questions first. And Anastasio, sir, and madam. That'll be our three last questions. But first, go to, please. Hennadiy and Swasti.
Okay.
Yeah.
Want to begin? Yeah.
Definitely. I think that Ukraine has all eyes set on Washington and what's going on in Congress. We see some uneasy processes, but let's be frank. There is little we can do about that. We can go advocate. We do that on level of expert, of level of parliament, of level of our government office, in even office of president. Just recently there was our defense minister, there was our head of presidential office. They tried to advocate, to talk, but we see the problem is there as well. So we still rely on United States. It is the biggest partner in arms deliveries, in financial support, and we still hope the situation would be positive for Ukraine. This on the level of hope, because we know that situation could change just in the next presidential elections. and it influences not only support but other layers of these tracks, as I mentioned. Peace formula, some cohesion to negotiations, and so on and so forth. So we have fingers crossed for that, but situation is not on us to decide, and unfortunately, we see that problem is there. The same goes with European Union. We have next week, there would be European Council decision, which is about Ukraine facility, 50 billion for 4 years. It is also blocked. Okay, we have guarantees that this instrument would be devoted for Ukraine for 4 years, but it's not even sufficient, and now it is blocked by one country or some countries which could align, but one country. So I think there is political processes, elections in European Parliament, elections to presidential elections and in Congress. So we do hope that the situation would somehow normalize, but I think without this Western support, as I said, we can't win the war.
Swasti, please.
Okay, so thank you for that question, and thank you, Chatham House Rules. We often talk about this in India, and I can share with you that usually we are only brainstorming about two options. One is that there's a staggering defeat for Russia by Ukraine. However, that alone is not going to make India stand up for Ukraine, because then the argument will be that, okay, it was all of NATO behind Ukraine which led to this crushing defeat of Russia, which was all alone, so poor Russia. So that's one. In my opinion, I don't agree with this. What I agree with is that it would take, unfortunately, and I hate saying so, but it would take some sort of a cataclysmic event at our line of actual control with China to actually, make us understand the value of standing up for democracy. So I would hate to say that, but in case of a war or a spiraling of a conflict with China that kind of spirals out of our control, we saw a tidbit happening in 2020 in Galvan, and one of the reasons why we start getting closer to the US was because of that. So not just me, but a lot of relatively more logical commentators and strategic thinkers in India would say that perhaps it would take some sort of an unfortunate incident at our LSE with respect to China, when we realize that all this multi-alignment and managing this with that and managing that with this is not going to work.
Okay, the last two questions, sir, madam, and it's okay? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask Swasti a question about de-dollarization. You mentioned the rupee-ruble mechanism.
Yeah.
I was curious what is India's position on de-dollarization? Is that something where they have a lot of cause for common grief with China? And if so, does that mean probably not, that they're willing to use the RMB, or what's the alternative then?
I'm very happy for that question. You want me to take that question? Meanwhile, yes. So very, very quickly, well, yes, de-dollarization, and not just in India, but in many parts of Global South, is usually touted as an emotion and not as a rational choice, because rationally speaking, there is no de-dollarization happening in the short term, and I can definitely tell you that with a lot of my research on it. So when it comes to India, on the one hand, you will see that India really loves to talk about, how there would be a BRICS currency in some time, although it is not going to happen, because India would not do anything that is going to add to China's economic clout in the world. And a BRICS currency, for that matter, would definitely be a currency which is going to be dominated by China, if at all. So there is absolutely no de-dollarization. Coming back to the rupee ruble, the thing is that rupee ruble, in my understanding, should be there as a plan B, because yes, for sure, there are a lot of countries that find themselves extremely vulnerable to the sanction regime and find their international transactions blocked because of these problems. Having said that, what has happened with Russia is that before the war started, we were buying less than 2% of our oil from Russia, and in this 20 months alone, now Russia sends us about 40% of the oil, and the only reason why we've been buying that oil is definitely not because of our friendship or this or that. It is purely because of the economic logic, because we've been getting discounts. Now, the thing is that while we have all this artificially propped up trade, the problem that we find ourselves in is this massive trade deficit. So the two top trade deficits that India runs today, the first is with China and the second is with Russia. And we have tried a lot of things, but it is not happening, not again because of lack of political will, but it is not happening because it cannot happening. It doesn't have economic logic. Ruble doesn't have a convertibility. It has a convertibility problem. It doesn't have transparency. And the bigger problem is that Russia is not ready to invest all those Indian rupees that it has sort of got in terms of, the trade oil and the S-400 100, the air defense systems that we've bought, Russia is not ready to invest it back into India. If Russia was ready to invest it back into India in a meaningful way, it would really reduce that trade deficit. But because Russia wants that money for the war in Ukraine, it is not doing it. And ultimately, we have come to an impasse where we have trillions of worth of Indian rupees in Russian accounts, in Indian banks. And the trade with respect to oil is not really a problem quickly because, we can always go back to Saudi Arabia and Iraq. The bigger problems is weapons, because out of 5 S-400s that we had ordered, we've only received 3. We have still not received 2. So this is the larger thing about the rupee-ruble mechanism, etc. I would like it to work at Plan B, but it is not really working.
Dernière question.
Thank you very much. My name is Catherine Mantel. I have one question which hasn't been addressed, and that's mainly to Velina. You didn't mention the present economic problems in China, because obviously further to the COVID, the situation, the recovery is really not what China was expecting. So how much will that impact what you've been saying? And regarding, I think from the economic point of view, it's more important for China to recover some of the links with the United States than anything else. Am I wrong? Am I right? What's your view on that? Thank you.
Yeah, Velina.
Should I take the question
Yes, please.
immediately? Or
You're the last
is there...
answer. Yeah, okay.
Yes. The opinions are very split right now. Practically we have 2 major, let's say, blocks of experts. The first one actually thinks that yes, indeed, there is an incentive to improve the relationship between United States and China, and this is what we are seeing right now because the Americans are preparing for election campaign, so they need stability and they need some kind of, let's say, positive messaging, but the Chinese also need stability, specifically when it comes to the economic situation. So there you go, you have this very big Xi Jinping-Biden meeting, and military-to-military communication channels were established, and so on and so forth. But there is also a second, let's say, group of experts that actually is not convinced that this is really, beyond the messaging, that there is going to be a real game changer. On the opposite, that actually this systemic decoupling is going to continue and it's going to affect all relevant socioeconomic networks. So global trade is continuously going to be affected. We will have a breakdown of the global supply chains, a reconfiguration, there you go. So all of this story. But let me remind you here that it took the Soviet Union more than 25 years to collapse. From the middle of, I think, mid-70s, when practically the United States won over the Soviet Union in the third industrial revolution, up until the beginning of the 90s when actually the Soviet Union imploded. It was a period in which the Soviet Union was in a perpetual economic struggle and decline. But there you go. We have now, that's why I said, I implied like 20 to 30 years, we are going to have a very, very rogue Communist Party. We are seeing already the first signs in China, centered around the leadership of Xi Jinping. It's a very different leadership. People disappear, people in key positions disappear, nobody knows where they are. We are going to see this also in the relations with third countries. So this is going to be a period in which China will continue to grow, not with the same speed, not with the same scale. There will be demographic change, but not with the same, let's say, not with the anticipated speed as it's, being predicted. But certainly, in these 10, 20 years, a lot is going to change. And here, that is why my message, my recommendation is for us to draw the right lessons here in Europe, because we are the weakening part on behalf of the West. The Americans are going to somehow, overcome the economic constraints. They are having societal problems. We see that, polarization, but the economics is doing fine. We are the ones really struggling, because we know for a fact that once the economics is weakening, this is going to have significant repercussions for societies here in the European states, and this is going to affect the political leadership as well. So I actually tend to share the second opinion, that is that China is going to be very different player. We are going to see a very different China in this decade and in the decade afterwards. And the number of hotspots we are having already too. What is going to happen now is that China, together with Russia, will open up a third front for the Americans amid the election campaign. In South China Sea, we are going to see probably the worst military escalation coming. They're going to provide North Korea with further satellite technology and rocket technology just to really pressure the Americans to get overstretched on three fronts. And this, of course, will increase also the need for diplomatic maneuvers, diplomatic actions. So that is why I think that we should be, we should prepare for the worst and hope for the best scenario. I would say. Maybe just
because we have one more. Sorry, Velina, we have one more question. Anastasia worked really hard to try to get one last question in. Sorry. And we have 2 minutes. You know, when Ukraine advocates, we have to respond.
I love it with Guillaume, and I was allowed. But it's true that my question is going to Niegale. That's why it's also very good, since nobody has asked anything about Africa during the Q&A session. And I have 2 short questions in sequence. First, when Russia organized a first Russia-Africa summit in 2019, over 40 leaders attended from over 40 African countries. The second African summit this year, only 17 leaders showed up. Why is that? That's the first question. And the second question is, Russia is one of the most racist countries on earth. African students get murdered in the streets of Moscow and numerous other Russian cities where they study every year. Racism is an integral culture, and we can say a backbone of Russian joke culture. Why doesn't it damage Russian reputation in Africa? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So very quickly, as regards the second Russian-Africa summit, it's just showing that Russia is not everywhere in Africa, and that African states are also negotiating their participation, their adhesion to what Russia is proposing. It's not automatic. Once again, Africans are not aligned behind Russia. They are not instrumentalized by Russia, but it is a partner they are considering where they tend to see a shared interest in working with it, in my view. That's my first answer. And the second one, racism, unfortunately, is spreading all over the world, including in Africa. And it's very important, I think, to realize it today. Today, you have an increasingly influent movement, which is black supremacism, which is spreading all over Africa. And it is not very reassuring, neither. That's not to say that there is no problem with racism in Russia, of course. But let's see also that Africans are not only victims. They're also players, and then sometimes can be also bad players.
Very clear words from all of our speakers on very touchy subjects. Please, for all of them, give them a hand. And now, as we're way over time, so we will release the dais for the next panel. Thank you very much.